How would you define evil? What does evil mean to you? How does evil work? What are the sources of evil? What is the nature of evil? These are some of the questions that we explored from different angles for 6 weeks recently here at UCF in a course titled Evil, a Liberal Religious Investigation. And these are important questions to ask because historically, one of the weaknesses of liberal religious traditions such as Unitarian Universalism has been a naive optimism. In rejecting the extreme pessimism of some Orthodox religious traditions, belief that humans are born with original sin, the total depravity of human beings, the corrupt nature of the world and society, in rejecting that, many of our Unitarian and our Universalist forebears overestimated the perfectibility of human nature, the possibility of building utopian societies, and the inevitability that we're just going to definitely have the progress of humankind onward and upward forever, as they said in the 19th century. So whereas many Orthodox religious traditions have overestimated evil as literally real, liberal religious traditions have often underestimated evil as something that will be soon and quickly overcome through the right application of human reason and ingenuity. As the Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, "If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds and necessary only to separate them from the rest of us, and then the rest of us would just be left good." But he writes, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts enough to allow space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is at various ages and various circumstances a totally different human being. At times close to being a devil, at times a saint. From good to evil is one quaver, says the proverb, and correspondingly, from evil to good. When I look into my own heart, if I'm honest, I know this to be true. And what do you see when you reflect on your experiences of good and evil within yourself, within others, and in this world? When I try to define evil or any other such heavily freighted word, I try to keep in mind that these are ultimately just words in our human language. They are imperfect tools for communication that have evolved in meaning over time for contingent historical reasons. As one of our Unitarian forebears quipped in the early 20th century, he said, "I spell my God with 2 O's and my devil without a D." So instead of a literal metaphysical devil, early humanists, they removed that initial D and simply called some actions evil. And instead of a literal metaphysical God, they added an O and simply called some actions good. To explore more deeply, I'd like to invite you to consider the social psychologist Stanley Milgram's infamous obedience experiments. Does that come to mind? Anybody? Psych 101, vague recollections of Milgram, very good. Have any of you seen the 2015 film The Experimenter about Milgram? There's a few of you, I see a few has not. It's really excellent. It's a biopic about his life. So The Experimenter, I think it's still streaming on Netflix and likely other platforms. I recommend it. Stanley Milgram was the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, but both his parents arrived in this country well before World War II. Nevertheless, his Jewish heritage did contribute to his interest in understanding how could human beings possibly have participated and do participate in genocide. Another influence on how Milgram chose to design his work was a previous study on independence and conformity that had been done by one of his mentors, Solomon Asch. Asch's most famous experiment invited a volunteer test subject to come into the room, sit at this table, and there were 7 other participants already seated at this long table. And allegedly, they were told, this study is about perceptual judgment. But here's the twist. Those original 7 people already sitting at the table, the participant thought that they were all just like them, test subjects about perceptual judgment. But they were all in on it, just with the exception of that last person to come into the room. They were all working with Ash and following a script. So Ash would stand in front of all 8 participants and hold up different sets of 4 vertical lines. And each person in turn had to say aloud which of the other 3 vertical lines matched the first one. So there were 18 sets of 4 lines in total, and the initial 7 participants always went first, and in turn, leaving the real test subject to go last, and to see whether he or she was influenced by the people that went before him or her. On the first few rounds, the experiment seemed absurdly easy, choosing which line matches the other. But after having the first 7 choose the correct line the first few times, they began to purposefully choose the incorrect line in a predetermined 12 of the 18 trials. So as person after person would choose the same incorrect line, the real test subject was faced with this growing internal dilemma. Am I crazy? That line doesn't match. Should I trust my own perceptions, or should I go with what everyone else has said? And resisting peer pressure can be hard when, at least for some people, when 7 individuals before you have all said confidently that a correct answer that clearly seems to you to be wrong is correct. So, think about it. You're sitting there at the table and they're like, yep, line 3. Yep, 3. Definitely 3. 3, 3, 3, 3. And you're like, it's not 3, it's 1 or whatever. But as it turns out, subjects went along with the bogus majority's answers about 1/3 of the time. Keep that result in mind. About 1/3 of the time, people would rather conform to the majority, that they are pretty sure is wrong, rather than risk going out on a limb to support an unpopular position that they are pretty sure is actually correct. Milgram's own obedience experiments were conducted starting in 1961 in New Haven, Connecticut. They were advertised in this case as a study of memory. Participants were paid $4.50, which adjusted for inflation would be about $36 today, so not bad for just an hour or so of work. The money was paid at the beginning, and participants were assured that they could keep the money regardless of what happens, to be sure that participants did not feel coerced to continue to make sure that they were paid. Citizens of New Haven who responded to the ad ranged from 20 to 50 years old, and similar to Ash's conformity study, participants in Milgram's obedience experiments were led to believe that there were 2 subjects being studied about how well they did with memory. But in fact, everyone else was part of the participant team except for 1 person. Both participants were asked to come into the room to draw a slip of paper for their roles in this memory study, and they were said, now one of these slips of paper says teacher and one of them says learner. But it turns out both slips of paper said teacher, and the person who was the fake participant would say, oh, well, mine says learner, when in fact it said teacher. The teacher was then led to a box that said shock generator. Some of this information may be shocking your memories back into remembering these experiments. And there was a series of switches on that shock generator that read from 15 volts to 450 volts in 15-volt increments. There were additional labels that grouped every 4 switches, because you may not know off the top of your head, how bad is it to get 15 volts versus 450? They were grouped into sets of 4 that said slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and then the last 2 said ominously XXX over the top of them. The teacher was instructed to administer a series of memory tests through a microphone to the learner, who was seated in the next room, and then they shut the door. Whenever the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher was to flip the next strip up to see if the increasing intensity of shock would help the person remember, or how that would affect their memory. Now, the machine didn't actually shock the person in the next room, but it appeared to. It had a series of realistic lights and meters and buzzing sounds that were equivalent with the increasing shock. The pre-planned script ensured a series of wrong answers, and the teacher was instructed to, we got to do this. Just keep administering the shocks in the face of increasingly pitiful and painful pleas, including things like, "I have a heart condition, please stop." And these painful pleas had been pre-recorded, so every participant heard the same one. So when they flipped the shock, it would cue a pre-recorded script. The teacher was also given an actual shock of 45 volts at the beginning, so they would have some point of reference, especially as they started to get to the final shock label of 450 volts, which was 10 times the amount that they had actually received at the beginning. Disturbingly, 65% of the subjects continue to obey the experimenter all the way to the end, despite objections, despite cries of pain and screaming from the other room, simply because the person in the white coat commanded them to do so. Many questioned at various points, should I definitely continue? But again, when assured by the scientists in the white coat that it was vital to the experiment to continue, a significant majority set aside their conscience, their better judgment, and submitted to the instruction of the authority figure. Milgram's experiments have been repeated in the decades since by scientists that show similar results. These studies consistently show with stunning clarity that ordinary individuals can be induced by an authority figure to act destructively even in the absence of physical coercion, and that it didn't take evil or aberrant individuals to carry out actions that were immoral and inhumane. While one might think that when confronted with a moral dilemma, I'll definitely act the way my conscience dictates, it turns out that in concrete situations containing powerful social pressures, our moral sense can readily get trampled underfoot. So prior to his obedience experiments, Milgram wrote that he really just didn't think it was possible, even given the much larger population of the United States compared to Germany, to find enough, what he called in his words, moral imbeciles, to staff the number of death camps that had been built in Germany during the Holocaust. After conducting these obedience experiments, Milgram wrote, "I am now beginning to think that the full complement could be recruited in New Haven alone." A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, Milgram wrote, irrespective of the content of the act and without pangs of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. The political theorist Hannah Arendt called this phenomenon the banality of evil. In her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, in watching the trial of the Nazi leader Adolf Eichmann, she became convinced that Eichmann wasn't this uniquely sadistic monster, and that was the problem. It would be easier if he were a uniquely sadistic monster. We just kill him, like Solzhenitsyn said. We just put him away, and then we're left with wholly good people. Rather, she became convinced that the truth was much more disturbing. Eichmann was an uninspired bureaucrat who simply sat at his desk and did his job as he had been instructed to do. Relatedly, Nazi records have also shown, parallel to these psychological studies on conformity and obedience, that when orders were given to begin large-scale executions, in some cases, 50% or so would refuse to do so initially, but they would still allow the other 50% to carry out these terrible orders. But over time, increasing numbers would participate so that you got toward the end about 90% of people carrying out these heinous acts as other people modeled them. From a more hopeful perspective, the opposite is also the case. One dissenter can inspire a cascade of rebellion against an unjust authority. But you need that crucial first person with the bravery to protest, as well as the essential second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth people to step up in solidarity in order to create a potential domino effect. Indeed, Milgram ran a variation in which there were 3 teachers, and 2 of them were actors. So when the fake teachers defied the experimenter and refused to continue, one at around 150 volts and the other at 210 volts. 90% of the naive subjects followed their examples and dropped out at some point before reaching 450 volts. So when courage and conscience was modeled for them, 90% dropped out versus 65% continuing when there was no modeling. No other variation Milgram conducted was as effective in undercutting the power of authority as someone modeling dissent. Have any of you seen the TED Talk, How to Start a Movement? It's the one about shirtless dancing guy. Some of you remember that? Okay, shirtless dancing guy. Some of you are remembering that. So what you see is it's on a bright, it's a hill, it's a bright sunny day, and these people are watching a concert, and all of a sudden, shirtless dancing guy gets up and just starts dancing really, really badly and wildly and erratically. And what this is about, so the video goes on for about 3 minutes, and what you start to see is that it's the first follower who transforms the lone nut into the leader. That's part of the, how do you start a movement? If you just had that one shirtless dancing guy, everyone goes home talking about, there was this crazy shirtless dancing guy at the concert. But that first follower transforms that lone nut into a leader. The second follower transforms the 2 lone nuts into a crowd. And a crowd begins to be news. And then you get momentum. An increasing number of people on the video start coming forward. And increasingly, the risk becomes, the risk is really increasingly less risk of standing out and being ridiculed, and it becomes a tipping point where if you don't hurry, you're not going to be part of the in crowd who was up there dancing before everyone started doing it. And if you wait too long, you can actually be made fun of now for not stepping up and dancing and being the square that's on the hill. So all of a sudden the story is, what about this, the sad person on the hill that didn't join this great dance party? Instead of the story could have been, there was this crazy shirtless dancing guy on the hill. So if there were more time, I'd love to give you more details about Milgram's experiment as well as related findings from Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment and other such studies. To give you just a brief highlight of the second case, average citizens were recruited off the streets of Palo Alto, California in 1971 to be part of a 2-week prison simulation. But the experiment was canceled prematurely after just a few days because almost immediately it became too dangerous, too volatile, and too psychologically harmful to continue. So when divided at random into prisoners and guards, these average U.S. citizens who underwent some psychological tests to make sure they were stable enough for this study, and even knowing that it was all an experiment and any of them could leave at any time, they began almost immediately to inhabit their roles in abusive and disturbing ways. Zimbardo said that the most essential lesson that emerged for him from this Stanford prison experiment was the power of systems on influencing our behavior. His important metaphor is that too often with Abu Ghraib, which he was called to testify about in other places, we say, oh, it's just a few bad apples. And he said, no, it's not a few bad apples. The real problem in most cases is that pretty good apples are put into a bad barrel that causes them to spoil quickly. It's really the barrel, the system, that needs to change. Along these lines, one of the reasons that I'm committed to our Unitarian Universalist movement is that we come from a long line of heretics. Heretics, simply, the word heretic comes from the Greek word heresis. It just means to choose. It means to choose for yourself instead of just doing it because we've always done it this way or because an authority figure tells you to. We come from a long line of heretics who can continue to inspire us to challenge corrupt systems and unjust authorities. In 1553, our Unitarian forebear, Michael Servetus, was martyred. He was burned at the stake by John Calvin for questioning the doctrine of the Trinity and the necessity of infant baptism. But his memory continues to inspire people in his time and today to question unreasonable belief systems. In 1863, our Universalist forebear, Olympia Brown, became the first, 1863, Olympia Brown became the first woman ordained with full denominational authority. She worked for women's right to vote from girlhood, and she was finally able to cast her ballot in 1920 at age 85. In 1859, as part of the abolitionist movement against slavery in this country, if you look at the Secret Six who helped fund and supply John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, 5 were Unitarians, 2 were Unitarian ministers. During the Vietnam era, when Daniel Ellsberg was looking for someone to publish the Pentagon Papers, the only publisher brave enough was our UU publishing house, Beacon Press. In retrospect, this choice was clearly a courageous act of civil disobedience, but to remind us of how hard these decisions can be to make in the present, we should remember that Beacon Press found itself, after publishing the Pentagon Papers, in a spiral of 2.5 years of harassment, intimidation, near bankruptcy, and the possibility of criminal prosecution. After publishing the papers, Beacon Press got a call from the bank and said, you need to come down here because FBI agents are here and they want to know the name of every Unitarian Universalist who was given to the UUA, in recent years. It was basically, McCarthy-era style intimidation. There's so many more examples I could give, but the lesson is that although there are individual evil acts, for the most part, good and evil acts are shaped strongly by the institutions and the systems in which we find ourselves. Moreover, as many of us heard from Brian Stevenson, all of us, each of us, is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And I know that being part of this congregation locally and of the Unitarian Universalist movement continentally and globally, that it challenges me to be better than I would be otherwise, to listen more closely to my conscience, to be more likely to make that first move against injustice, or to be willing to stand in solidarity with others who have made first acts of resistance or protest. As Dr. King said after studying the work of our UU forebear, Henry David Thoreau, I became convinced by Thoreau that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. So stand up, speak up when you see our first principle being violated, when you are there and you witness someone's inherent worth and dignity being violated. Stand up, speak up against it and for that person. Stand up and speak up when your conscience is tugging at your heart. Don't stay silent. Stand up and speak up that together we might build a better world with peace, liberty, and justice. Not just for some, but for all. To continue to look within your own heart as to where you stand and what you feel called to do, I invite you to rise and body your spirit. Let's sing together hymn 1028, Fire of Commitment.